Okay, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We're guests this week on our true identity, and we're thrilled to share a deep dive into a period we explore in our book, The Fullness of Time, a year-by-year journey toward the Christ.
That's right.
Today, we're going to unpack some, well, fascinating insights from the source material that shapes Chapter 3 of our book, focusing on a year that might seem, completely unremarkable on the surface, 12 BC.
It really might. If you were just scanning historical records from that era, you wouldn't see big flashing headlines about 12 BC.
Right.
It wasn't a year defined by massive battles that redrew maps or, the sudden collapse of empires. Life for most people just seemed to follow its usual rhythm.
Yet the material we delved into for this chapter presents a powerful counter-narrative. It suggests that this seemingly quiet year wasn't just another 12 months ticking by.
Not at all.
Far from it, actually. Our research really highlights 12 BC as an intensely purposeful period, an indispensable moment in the unfolding of what we describe in our book as the fullness of time.
Yeah, it makes the case that beneath the surface of everyday life, and across vastly different regions and cultures, the world was undergoing a subtle yet really profound preparation. Not through overt dramatic intervention that everyone would notice, but through the steady, sometimes unseen progress of time and circumstance.
So the core question guiding our deep dive today, and frankly this chapter of our book, is how was the world, in all its diverse complexity and daily routines, being meticulously prepared for a momentous, world-altering event, even as life appeared to just carry on as usual? Let's maybe set the stage for 12 BC.
Okay. To understand 12 BC, you really have to picture the geopolitical reality. Rome stands as the undeniable global superpower governed by Augustus.
Right.
And he's navigating this really delicate balance of consolidating absolute power while carefully maintaining the outward forms of the old republic. He's operating as princeps, the first citizen.
To kind of soothe fears about kingship.
Exactly, trying to avoid that direct association.
And within that vast empire, you have regions like Judea, a small, complex territory caught in this really difficult position, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's under Roman control,
Yeah.
ruled by a client king like Herod the Great, but its people are defined by this deep-seated religious identity and unique covenant history that creates constant tension.
And the sheer scale of the empire, from Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria, it's just immense.
It really is. And underlying all of this, from the perspective of the research for our book, was this palpable sense of anticipation, a quiet momentum building.
Not necessarily conscious, though.
Not for most people, no. But the stage was being set. 12 BC wasn't a detour or just some placeholder year. It was a crucial piece in the divine architecture of preparation, ensuring the conditions were precisely aligned for the appointed hour.
So it wasn't about the fireworks of historical events, but the quiet, essential laying of groundwork.
That's a good way to put it.
And nowhere was the outward display of power more evident than in Rome itself under Augustus. This was the beating heart of the empire, projecting this image of stability and might.
Absolutely. Augustus was a master of propaganda and governance. He knew how to wield power, absolutely, while still giving deference to traditions. By 12 BC, the Senate was largely a rubber stamp.
Right.
The old offices of the Republic were kind of emptied of their true authority, but they were still there, offering a veneer of continuity. His power was rooted in controlling the army, the finances, the key political levers.
But presenting it differently.
Yes, presenting it as the will of the people and the Senate. Very skillful.
And one of the most significant strategic moves he made was right there in 12 BC, wasn't it? He assumed the role of Pontifex Maximus.
Yes.
This wasn't just adding another title, was it? What was the impact of that specific action?
Oh, this was monumental. The Pontifex Maximus was the chief high priest of Roman state religion. So by taking this role, Augustus didn't just become head of state, he became the symbolic head of Rome's relationship with the divine. It was a profound binding of religion and politics under his personal authority. Civic loyalty to the emperor became inseparable from religious devotion to the gods, mediated through him.
Okay, so he's positioning himself
as the essential link between Rome and cosmic favor, not just ruler, but the bridge.
So supporting the emperor wasn't just a political act anymore. It was becoming a kind of religious duty.
Precisely. And the source material we studied shows how this was reflected throughout the empire. Temples were dedicated to Rome and Augustus. Sacrifices were offered for his well-being and in his name.
The cult of the emperor was growing.
Subtly at first, yeah, but steadily cementing his position as something more than human.
And the language used to describe him, it's absolutely striking. Our research for the book uncovered inscriptions and titles like Savior of the World, Bringer of Peace, Son of the Divine Julius. That language, it really resonates, doesn't it?
It does, profoundly. It's imperial propaganda using terms of ultimate significance, promising cosmic order and salvation through the emperor's rule. And as our source material points out, this very language would later be subverted and redeemed. Human ambition reaching for divine titles, unknowingly paving the way for the true Son of God to arrive and fill those very terms with entirely different, authentic meaning.
It highlights that recurring theme, doesn't it? Human structures, human language, built for earthly purposes, often become unwitting vessels for divine purposes.
Exactly. It's fascinating how that works.
So while Augustus was being hailed with these grand, almost divine titles, what was the reality like for the vast majority of people living in Rome itself? What did daily life look like in the capital in 12 BC?
Well, it was a stark contrast to the imperial pronouncements. Life for the common people was often grindingly difficult. The city was vast, crowded, expensive.
Yeah.
The poor struggled constantly just to secure basic necessities, enough food, a place to sleep that wasn't exposed to the elements. Artisans labored long hours in small, often dark workshops, their lives dictated by the demands of their craft and their customers.
And the scale of slavery. It's hard for us to fully grasp today.
It was immense. A huge proportion of the population consisted of slaves, people stripped of their freedom, their rights, their very identity, their lives entirely at the disposal of their masters.
And their labor propped up so much of society.
It really did. The economy depended on it. And the public spectacles, the chariot races, the brutal gladiatorial games, the elaborate feasts thrown by the wealthy.
They served a purpose.
A crucial, if temporary, distraction from these harsh realities. A way for the populace to vent energy or simply forget their struggles for a few hours.
But our research for this reveals a deeper layer beneath the surface, doesn't it? It speaks of the emptiness beneath the celebration of restless hordes, despite the outward peace and order Augustus had established.
Yes.
Rome provided order, yes, but our sources suggest it couldn't provide fulfillment.
This is a key insight. Rome's system of governance, its laws, its infrastructure, even its state religion, created a highly structured and outwardly stable society. The Pax Romana brought a degree of peace across the empire after generations of civil war. That was real. But according to the material we studied, this outward stability and the material abundance enjoyed by the elite couldn't address a deeper human need. There was a spiritual or, existential void, a restlessness that the impressive structures and elaborate rituals of empire just couldn't fill.
People had order and security.
But they lacked ultimate meaning and connection. That's what seems to be missing.
It's like having a perfectly built container, but the contents are missing or unsatisfying somehow.
That's a powerful way to put it.
You can build the strongest structure, but you can't engineer contentment or meaning.
Exactly. The human spirit yearned for something more than political stability or material provision. And Rome, for all its power, could not provide that something more.
And that Roman structure wasn't confined to the city, of course. It extended its reach across the known world.
Absolutely. The empire was a vast network. Provinces were governed by men loyal to Augustus, enforcing Roman law, collecting the heavy taxes, maintaining order, often through military presence.
And the legal system.
Expanding and being refined. While sometimes harsh, it provided a framework for society. The army was highly disciplined, efficient, capable of rapid deployment.
And the infrastructure projects. The roads, the bridges, the aqueducts. They were engineering marvels of their time, weren't they?
They were incredible achievements. The Roman road network alone crisscrossed the empire, linking distant cities with astonishing speed and efficiency.
We still see parts of them today.
We do. A testament to their engineering. Aqueducts brought fresh water into cities. Bridges spanned rivers. Harbors were expanded. It was impressive stuff.
And these weren't just for convenience or civic pride. They were the arteries of the empire, designed for military movement, administrative control, and crucially, trade.
Exactly. They facilitated the rapid movement of legions, governors, decrees, goods. But what our research highlighted is how, even as Rome built these for its own purposes, consolidating power, enriching the capital, projecting force, they were also, entirely unbeknownst to the engineers and emperors, preparing pathways for the rapid movement of something else entirely.
They were laying the groundwork for the spread of new ideas, for the journey of individuals carrying a message.
Precisely. The infrastructure built for the Pax Romana would also serve as the highways for the Prince of Peace. It's another example from our studies of how human systems, driven by earthly goals, were unknowingly contributing to a larger divine plan, creating a connected world where a message could travel swiftly and broadly.
Okay, so we've seen Rome, powerful, organized, building infrastructure, but with this underlying emptiness. Now let's shift our gaze east to Judea, a very different landscape, characterized by deep religious fervor and internal divisions.
Right. Jerusalem in 12 BC was dominated by the monumental building project on the Temple Mount. Herod the Great, the king Rome had installed, was pouring immense resources and effort into expanding and beautifying the Second Temple.
The one built by the exiles returning from Babylon.
That's the one. And this wasn't a simple facelift. It was an attempt to rival the wonders of the world.
The scale sounds staggering.
It was. Our research describes thousands of skilled laborers, unskilled workers employed. They were quarrying and transporting massive stones, some weighing many tons, shaping them with incredible precision.
Wow.
Elaborate columns were being erected. The courtyards were vastly extended to accommodate the hundreds of thousands of pilgrims who would come for festivals. It was designed to inspire awe.
A visible testament to Herod's power and wealth.
And perhaps his attempt to legitimize his rule in the eyes of his Jewish subjects, who were often suspicious of him.
And from Herod's perspective, this magnificent structure was his crowning achievement, wasn't it? A monument to himself as much as to God.
Yes, our sources really highlight this complex motivation. It was his greatest architectural feat, a symbol of his political savvy in navigating the tensions between Rome and Jewish tradition. He wanted it to be the most magnificent temple in the world, securing his legacy.
But the devotion behind it seems complicated.
Very much so. Intertwined with his ambition and, frankly, his ruthlessness.
Yet, just like Rome, the source material we explored brings a poignant counterpoint to this visible grandeur. It states, the emptiness remained.
Yes.
The most holy place, the heart of the temple, was vacant. The Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's tangible presence, was gone.
This is absolutely crucial to understanding the spiritual reality of Judea at this time. The stunning beauty, the sheer scale of the building, the continuation of the daily sacrifices and complex rituals, none of it could fully compensate for the absence of the Ark and the visible glory of God that had departed the First Temple centuries before.
So there's this deep spiritual longing.
Pulsing beneath the surface of religious activity, the people weren't just going through the motions. They were waiting for something, for the restoration of true glory, for the Lord's voice to break the centuries of silence since the last prophet spoke.
So you had this incredibly active, visually impressive religious life centered around this magnificent building, but an underlying ache, a void where true divine presence was longed for.
Exactly. The human effort to create something magnificent for God highlighted, perhaps unintentionally, the abscess that only God himself could fill. The structure was there, the rituals were performed, but the deepest spiritual need was for God to show up again.
And within this context of longing and religious activity, Judea wasn't a monolithic society. Our research reveals a complex mosaic of Jewish sects and groups, each with their own distinct interpretations of God's plan, the law, and how to live under Roman rule.
Yes.
Each was, in their own way, preparing, but maybe none fully grasped the full picture.
That's a key insight. This is vital for understanding the spiritual environment into which the Messiah would eventually come. These groups represented different responses to their historical situation and different understandings of their covenant identity and future hope.
Let's look at them. Starting with the Sadducees. Who were they?
The Sadducees were largely the priestly aristocracy concentrated around the temple, and they had closely allied themselves with Herod and, by extension, with Rome. Their primary concern was maintaining their power and the status quo. Our sources note their theology was rather constrained. They denied the resurrection of the dead, held a more limited view of God's direct action in history.
Which fits with their focus on earthly power.
It does align, yes. They were focused on maintaining the current system. They were the establishment.
Then you have the Pharisees, perhaps the most well-known group to many people.
Yes, the Pharisees were scattered throughout the land in towns and villages, gathering in synagogues and study houses. They were passionate teachers of the law, not just the written Torah, but also the extensive body of oral traditions that had developed over centuries.
Which they believed were equally binding.
Exactly. They emphasized meticulous adherence to these laws, believing that national faithfulness and purity could hasten the Messiah's arrival.
But their expectations were specific.
Our research highlights that their expectations were often shaped by their earthly expectations. They were looking for a Messiah who would bring about national righteousness through strict legal observance and perhaps political liberation through religious means.
And their focus on detail could be burdensome.
Yes, the source notes that their emphasis on legal minutiae could sometimes place unbearable burdens on the common people just trying to live faithfully.
And the Essenes took a completely different approach, didn't they?
Totally different. The Essenes were the separatists. Convinced that the temple worship and the ruling priesthood were utterly corrupt, they withdrew into isolated communities, particularly near the Dead Sea, like the group associated with the Qumran scrolls.
Right, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Exactly. They believed the current age was irredeemably corrupt and waited for a purifying divine intervention, often viewing themselves as the true remnant of Israel. Their writings speak of apocalyptic battles, divine judgments, a coming teacher of righteousness.
So their preparation was withdrawal and spiritual purity.
In essence, yes, a radical separation from what they saw as a corrupt system.
And while maybe more prominent later, the seeds of the Zealot movement were present even then.
Yes, our research indicates that the simmering resentment under Roman rule was already giving rise to groups who believed that faithfulness to God required active, even violent resistance against foreign occupation.
Whiskers of rebellion.
Exactly. Training for confrontation, dreaming of a Messiah who would be a military leader to forcibly deliver Israel from Rome's grasp.
So you see this incredible spectrum: collaboration with power, meticulous legalism, spiritual withdrawal, violent resistance. It's quite a mix.
It really is. And the insight from our sources is that while each group was, in their own way, preparing for God's action or the Messiah, none of them fully grasped the coming mystery. Each had a flawed or incomplete understanding of God's plan.
Their very divisions reflected the differing hopes and fears within Israel at the time.
Absolutely. They were all looking, they were all waiting, but their human expectations and strategies often blinded them to what God was actually preparing to do, which would, frankly, defy all of their preconceived notions.
And beneath these religious and political tensions, the daily lives of ordinary people were marked by significant social and economic pressures.
Oh, definitely. Roman rule and Herod's projects were expensive, and the burden of taxation fell heavily on the common people, the farmers, the laborers, the small merchants.
A familiar story.
It is. They faced struggles with debt. Many small farmers were losing their ancestral lands, forced to become tenant farmers or migrate to cities seeking day labor. This created a widening gap between the wealthy elite who benefited from the system and the vast majority who lived really precarious lives.
For many faithful Jews, this economic hardship wasn't just bad luck, was it? It felt like oppression, a violation of the covenant promises of justice and blessing in their own land.
Precisely. This economic and social tension significantly fueled their longing for the Messiah. They didn't just long for religious purity or political independence. They yearned for a deliverer who would bring justice.
Someone who would level the playing field.
Yes, care for the poor, restore righteousness within their society, not just deliver them from Rome.
And our research highlights a poignant insight here.
Yeah.
The poor, the meek, the weary, the ones bearing the heaviest burdens of taxation and social inequality, they were longing for a kingdom that would finally lift them up, a deliverer who would see their plight.
Yes.
And the source material notes they were unknowingly waiting for one that would turn the world upside down, a kingdom unlike any earthly kingdom they could imagine, one centered on justice and grace for the marginalized.
It reveals how the very real human experience of suffering and injustice was woven into the spiritual longing of the time, preparing hearts for a savior who would come not in earthly power, but in humility, addressing the deepest needs of the human soul and society.
Okay. Moving away from the intense centers of power and religious debate in Jerusalem and Rome, let's turn our attention to Galilee. Our research describes life here as having a kind of quiet rhythm.
Yes, Galilee felt much more provincial, more agricultural and rural, compared to the bustling intensity of the capital or the religious focus of Jerusalem. Life revolved around the ancient, simple patterns of agrarian society.
Planting and harvesting.
Exactly. The cycle of crops, the daily work of fishing on the Sea of Galilee, the mundane tasks of mending tools and nets. It was a world shaped by the seasons and the land.
But even in these quieter villages, faith was central to life, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The synagogue wasn't just a place of worship. It was the heart of communal life. This is where people gathered multiple times a week, especially on the Sabbath.
A center for learning, too.
Yes, where children were taught the ancient stories and laws of the Torah. Each week, sections of the Law of Moses and the writings of the prophets were read aloud, discussed, debated. It was a constant immersion in the sacred history and promises of Israel.
And our research specifically singles out one such village in Galilee, Nazareth.
Nazareth. a small, unassuming village, largely unknown to the wider world at this time, and within Nazareth lived the family of Joseph and Mary. Our sources emphasize how their lives remained largely unknown,
Just ordinary lives.
defined by the simple yet demanding duties of family, trade, and personal devotion.
Joseph is identified as a carpenter.
Yes, a skilled craftsman, often referred to as a tekton, which could actually encompass working with wood, stone, or even metal.
Ah, interesting.
Our research suggests his work might have connected him to nearby construction projects in growing cities like Sepphoris, which was being rebuilt and expanded around that time.
And Sepphoris was a hub.
A significant one where Hellenistic culture, Roman administration and law, and Jewish tradition all intersected.
So even Joseph's ordinary trade placed him in a context where different cultural streams were mingling,
That's interesting.
creating a unique environment.
Exactly. It meant that the cultural world he inhabited, and the world Mary was part of, was uniquely prepared for a message that would eventually transcend cultural boundaries. A message that would resonate with people steeped in Jewish scripture, but also familiar with Greek language and the broader Roman world.
And Mary's life. How was she prepared?
Mary's life, too, was deeply rooted in the traditions and faith of Israel. Raised within a devout Jewish family, her daily rhythm would have included reciting psalms, singing the songs of deliverance that spoke of God's mighty acts in history and his future promises.
Pondering the scriptures.
Yes, pondering the scriptures she heard in the synagogue. Our sources highlight how she might have heard the words of the prophet Isaiah read aloud on a Sabbath. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light.
On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned.
Exactly. That hope of a great light coming was deeply embedded in her spiritual landscape.
And our book emphasizes something profound about Joseph and Mary, doesn't it? They were unseen by the world, unnoticed by rulers, yet their lives were being gently formed by the hand of providence.
Yes.
Mary, in particular, was chosen from before the world's foundation, being prepared in this quiet, hidden way.
This is a key insight our research underscores. God's most significant preparations often occur not on the grand public stages of empire or religious power, but in obscurity, in the quiet corners of the world, in the lives of seemingly ordinary people.
Joseph's quiet righteousness.
His integrity, his faithfulness to God's law, even when it was difficult, and Mary's quiet dignity and profound faith are highlighted as the very qualities God saw and prepared for their central roles.
Their hidden lives were, in fact, absolutely crucial to the divine plan.
Paradoxically, yes, their obscurity was part of the preparation.
Moving beyond the borders of Judea, our research for the fullness of time also explores the wider world and the intellectual and spiritual currents flowing through it in 12 BC.
Right, like Alexandria in Egypt.
Yeah.
A prime example. It was one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world, with its famous library and vibrant intellectual scene.
Yeah.
Scholars there were engaged in deep philosophical debates, attempting to understand the nature of reality, the divine, the human condition, often blending Greek philosophical traditions with elements of Eastern mysticism.
And there was a significant Jewish community there producing notable thinkers like Philo.
Yes, Philo of Alexandria was a towering intellectual figure. He sought to harmonize the truths of the Hebrew scriptures with Greek philosophy, particularly drawing on Plato and the Stoics.
And he wrote about the Logos.
Extensively, interpreting it not just as divine reason or the organizing principle of the universe, but as something akin to God's active power or intermediary in creation and revelation.
Which, of course, uses language that would later be profoundly significant in Christian theology, particularly in the Gospel of John.
Exactly. Our research notes that while Philo didn't conceive of the Logos as a distinct person who would become flesh, his philosophical reflections, the very language he used, the questions he wrestled with about bridging the gap between the transcendent God and the material world.
They served as bridges.
Crucial intellectual bridges for proclaiming Christ to a world steeped in both Jewish scripture and Greek philosophical thought. His intellectual searching, though incomplete, was part of the broader preparation.
And Alexandria was also instrumental in the Septuagint, that Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures.
A monumental achievement, produced by Jewish scholars in Alexandria over generations. It was a work of quiet, often unseen labor.
But vital.
Absolutely vital. By making the entire body of Jewish scripture accessible to the vast Greek-speaking Jewish diaspora across the empire and to interested Gentiles who could read Greek, it was performing an absolutely vital work of preparing a way for the gospel to cross cultural boundaries.
Our research highlights this translation work as not an accident, but part of God's meticulous provision.
Yes, ensuring that the ancient prophecies and history of God's covenant were available in the common language of the empire.
So even seemingly academic pursuits and translation work were part of this grand global preparation.
Precisely. The spread of a common language Greek, facilitated by Hellenistic culture and Roman rule, and the translation of scripture into that language were essential elements in creating the conditions for the rapid dissemination of the gospel later on.
Okay, let's look at other parts of the empire, like Asia Minor, with its bustling cities. Ephesus, Pergamum.
Right. Cities like Ephesus, Pergamum, and Smyrna were vibrant centers of commerce under Roman rule, characterized by immense wealth and a bewildering diversity of religious practices.
Temples everywhere.
Temples to ancient Greek deities like Artemis or Zeus stood alongside newer cults, and increasingly, temples dedicated to the emperor himself as a divine figure, a real marketplace of gods and worship.
People were participating actively. Sacrifices, rituals.
Yes. People participated in sacrifices, rituals, prayers, seeking tangible benefits. Fertility for their crops or families, prosperity in their businesses, protection from disease or misfortune. They were actively seeking divine power to improve their lives.
But our sources reveal that familiar theme again. Beneath it all lingered a dissatisfaction that no idol could fill.
Despite the elaborate rituals and the multitude of gods, there was a deep spiritual hunger, a searching that the pagan cults ultimately couldn't satisfy.
Seeking gods who couldn't hear.
As the prophets of Israel had declared, yes, offering worship to powers that couldn't truly save or provide lasting peace. The sheer multiplicity of options might have even highlighted the lack of a single satisfying answer.
And yet, even in these centers of polytheism and emperor worship, there were those quiet witnesses. The synagogues.
Exactly. Jewish communities were established in most major cities across the empire, maintaining their monotheistic faith, their scriptures, their distinct way of life, in stark contrast to the surrounding culture.
And our research describes them as tilling the soil of the Gentile world.
Yes. They offered a glimpse of ethical monotheism, of a personal God who had made a covenant with his people and had a plan unfolding through history. They also attracted God-fearers.
Gentiles drawn to Jewish morality.
Yes, drawn to the morality and monotheism without fully converting. These synagogues were quietly increasing spiritual hunger and preparing receptive hearers for the gospel message that would eventually arrive in their cities.
What about the further reaches of the empire and Rome's great rival in the east, Parthia?
Well, Roman expansion continued in areas like Gaul and Germania, requiring constant military presence. This meant legions, fortresses, and the extension of Roman infrastructure like roads into these new territories.
The Pax Romana again. Opportunity and oppression.
Both, definitely. But again, the movement of soldiers, administrators, merchants, and colonists along these newly secured routes created pathways for the flow of people, goods, and crucially, ideas. Our book notes that the gospel would eventually follow these very pathways laid by Roman expansion.
And Parthia, the eastern rival.
Parthia represented Rome's primary geopolitical challenge in the east. Border skirmishes, diplomatic maneuvering, shifting alliances were constant features of their relationship. This created a complex buffer zone, particularly relevant to the status of Judea, caught between these two powers.
And rulers there were just focused on their own power.
Our research observes that rulers in Parthia, like those in Rome and Judea, were focused on consolidating their own power, expanding their territory, navigating the intricate dance of international politics, driven purely by human ambition and earthly concerns.
Completely oblivious, of course, to the true king who was drawing near, not through military might or imperial decree.
A profound irony our research highlights. While emperors and kings plotted their worldly strategies, a far greater story was unfolding. Their actions, born of ambition and rivalry, were paradoxically part of the larger unseen divine plan, shaping the global landscape and creating specific conditions for the arrival of a kingdom fundamentally different from their own.
Unwitting participants in a cosmic drama.
That's a good way to think about it.
So we've explored the visible aspects of the world in 12 BC, the empires, the religions, the daily lives, but our research also speaks of unseen forces at work during this year, contributing to this gathering anticipation for the fullness of time.
Yes, there is a clear cosmic dimension to the events around 12 BC. Our research points first to the Magi in distant lands, studying the heavens.
These weren't part of the covenant people of Israel, were they? Yet they were seekers looking for divine signs.
Exactly. They were likely priests or wise men from the east, perhaps from the Parthian Empire or further afield, who studied astronomy, astrology, and ancient prophecies.
Familiar with texts about signs and kings.
Possibly, yes. Texts that spoke of cosmic signs accompanying the birth of kings and potentially ancient prophecies from cultures that had interacted with Israel. Perhaps remnants of Daniel's prophecies from the Babylonian exile about a coming ruler.
So they were scanning the skies.
Watching for unusual celestial events, planetary alignments, new stars, comets, and debating their meaning. They weren't just academic astronomers. They were looking for signs of significant divine activity impacting the Earth.
Okay.
Our sources highlight them as distant seekers, their hearts being stirred, their vigilance sustained. Their actual journey to find the Christ child wouldn't commence in 12 BC, but their preparation,
They're watching, they're searching.
their intellectual and spiritual readiness that was ongoing during this year, they represent a key strand of this global preparation.
Then our research points to the angelic realm itself, that spiritual dimension.
Yes, it's critical. Our sources describe the angelic hosts watching the unfolding events on Earth with reverent anticipation. They had witnessed creation, delivered messages throughout history, engaged in spiritual battles. They understood the state
The long conflict.
between God's purposes and the adversary, yes. And in 12 BC, they stood ready, knowing that the moment was drawing near, that soon one would be sent with an extraordinary message.
Gabriel specifically is mentioned later as drawing near for that message.
Exactly. The specific messenger who would announce the imminent arrival of the Messiah. The angelic hosts knew what the vast majority of the world on earth did not. The king was coming, and heaven was poised to break its silence in a spectacular way.
And on the opposing side, the spiritual forces of darkness. Our research acknowledges them.
It does. Acknowledges the pervasive work of the adversary, Satan, active since Eden, sowing deception, fostering despair, introducing corruption and conflict.
Seen in things like Herod's court, temple corruption.
Yes, reflected in palace intrigues, aspects of corruption within the religious establishment, the suffering of the oppressed, the widespread practice of idolatry. The adversary's influence was present.
But the source material makes a crucial point. Even his schemes were powerless to prevent what was coming.
This is the ultimate truth underlying the year. The light was drawing near, and the darkness, despite its efforts, would not overcome it.
In fact, the darkness would highlight the light.
In a way, yes. Every plot, every act of cruelty, every injustice perpetrated by human agents influenced by dark forces would, in the grand scheme of things, ultimately highlight the splendor of the redemption that was about to burst forth into the world.
The unseen spiritual conflict was real, its effects were tangible.
Absolutely, in human suffering. But the outcome was certain. The adversary's efforts, though causing pain, could not thwart God's ultimate plan, but rather, in a twisted way, underscored the necessity and glory of the salvation to come.
So 12 BC wasn't just about visible earthly events. It had this profound, unseen spiritual conflict and divine anticipation woven right into its fabric.
And through it all, our research emphasizes the year moved forward quietly, without grand spectacle, not recorded in annals of kings as some pivotal moment.
Yet, despite the lack of fanfare, it was indispensable. That's the word used.
Yes. The weight of waiting continued to build. The world, in its diverse expressions of restlessness and longing, whether that was the philosophical searching in Alexandria, the spiritual hunger in Asia Minor, the messianic anticipation in Judea, or just the simple human yearning for justice and meaning, was being drawn irresistibly toward the coming of the Christ.
The slow march of preparation continued, often invisible to most, but unstoppable to all.
Yes. Our sources point out the ordinary events happening. Babies were born, the elderly passed away, priests performed their duties, teachers instructed their students, rulers issued decrees, ordinary people went about their daily tasks.
Unknowingly?
Not knowing that eternity was bending ever closer. Their lives and their very ordinariness in 12 BC were unfolding on the cusp of the most extraordinary event in history.
As we moved through our research for Chapter 3 of The Fullness of Time, we saw how these threads continued to weave together, highlighting how seemingly mundane affairs were part of this larger building climax.
Yeah, it reiterates the idea of waking to routines, the sunrise, the start of work, Roman governors issuing their administrative decrees, levying taxes, Judean administrators working under Herod,
Census rolls, land disputes,
collecting the temple tax. All the machinery of everyday life and governance was turning, just as it had for centuries.
and our book argues that these were but footnotes in a larger story, one that was building toward its climax with unrelenting certainty.
It really places human activity in perspective within the sweep of divine history, doesn't it? Our daily concerns, our political systems, our economic activities, They are the stage, the backdrop upon which God's plan unfolds.
Real and significant to us, but
But the ultimate narrative arc is determined by something far greater.
where crucial preparation continued most profoundly in obscurity. We keep coming back to that.
Yes, our research draws us back to Mary. Her life, hidden from the world's public stage in a small village, filled with simple tasks, fetching water, grinding grain, caring for her family, marked by obedience and devotion to God.
Unseen by the world, but treasured in heaven.
That life was the crucible in which she was prepared. She was, by 12 BC, on the brink of being chosen.
And Joseph.
A man steady in his work, reliable, skilled as a carpenter. A man of immense integrity and quiet devotion, trained by Scripture, knowledgeable in the law and the prophets. Our sources highlight that he was a man whom God saw.
Being prepared for his unique role.
As the earthly guardian and protector of the Messiah and his mother, God valued his faithfulness and righteousness in the quiet, private sphere of his life.
Our chapter also revisited the intellectual and spiritual hunger we saw beyond Israel, adding more detail about how it specifically pointed to the need for something more, right?
It did. It delved deeper into Stoic and Epicurean philosophy, which grappled with profound questions about virtue, duty, fate, pleasure, pain.
Noble pursuits.
Absolutely. Our research acknowledges these were noble intellectual pursuits, but they ultimately couldn't satisfy the heart's deeper longing for intimacy, grace, love, meaning. They were asking questions it could not answer, questions that only incarnation could resolve. Philosophy could dissect the human condition but couldn't heal it.
And the diaspora synagogues and God-fearers played a specific role beyond just being witnesses. What was that again?
Yes, these communities, nurtured by the Septuagint, served as vital centers of learning, identity, and hope across the empire. They preserved the knowledge of the true God and his promises.
And the God-fearers they attracted.
They were Gentiles whose hearts were already turned towards monotheism and the moral clarity of the law, making them uniquely receptive hearers for the gospel when it arrived, offering them the fulfillment of the hope they had only glimpsed.
And the mystery religions, Isis, Mithras, Dionysus, they were spreading.
Rapidly across the empire, yes, offering secret rituals, emotional experiences, promises of personal salvation or connection with the divine to souls restless and dissatisfied with the traditional pagan pantheon.
They filled a void.
They did, offering a sense of belonging and mystery, but they remained distant, impersonal, offering shadow, not truth. They were human attempts to bridge the gap to the divine.
But they revealed that deep hunger.
Yes, they revealed the deep hunger of humanity for true communion, a communion that, again, only incarnation would satisfy. Their widespread appeal, despite their limitations, powerfully demonstrated the pervasive human need that the coming Christ would meet.
Even within the heart of the imperial family, our research saw seeds of the future being sown in 12 BC. Augustus was thinking ahead.
Constantly. Focused on the future of his empire, particularly on ensuring a stable succession. He was busy arranging alliances through marriage, appointing trusted men to positions of power, testing potential heirs.
All about stability for Rome.
His ambition was for the continuation of his dynasty and the peace of Rome.
And specifically, Tiberius is noted in the research.
Yes, Tiberius, Augustus's stepson. A capable military leader, but described as reserved, perhaps even cold. In 12 BC, he was already moving through the ranks, being groomed, poised to one day rule the vast empire.
Completely oblivious that his reign would coincide with the life, death, and resurrection of the one whom this entire historical moment was preparing for.
A powerful irony, as our book notes. The machinery of government turned according to human ambition, emperors planning for earthly succession. But the story being written through these political arrangements was far greater than any emperor's plan.
Human power structures just positioned on the chessboard.
Unknowingly positioned on the historical chessboard for God's ultimate move.
Exactly.
All these diverse threads weaving together pointed toward the imminent fullness of time. That's the sense we get.
Our research concludes that the 12 BC was indeed sacred preparation. It wasn't just random history, it was purposeful. It reiterates that the fullness of time was almost complete, the complex global stage nearly set.
The angelic hosts were waiting with bated breath, Gabriel's mission drawing ever nearer. Heaven was prepared to break its long silence in a glorious announcement. The Word, who was with God and was God, was preparing to become flesh and dwell among us. The seemingly ordinary year was accumulating immense, unseen significance with every passing day.
So to recap the weight of waiting in this year, 12 BC.
It passed, as our research shows, without major drama or recording in imperial chronicles for any singular earth-shattering event, yet it was indispensable.
Right.
It was a year where the building weight of waiting continued to build, a spiritual and historical pressure accumulating. The world's restlessness and longing, expressed in its philosophies, religions, yearning for justice, was drawing it, perhaps unknowingly but irresistibly, toward the coming of the Christ.
Our sources describe the quiet close of 12 BC as history turning an invisible corner, known only to heaven.
Yes, not to the historians writing the annals of kings. It uses a beautiful analogy. The building weight of waiting is like the tightening of strings before a great symphony's first note. The world's inhabitants, from the opulent palaces of Rome to the quiet synagogues of Galilee, from the scholarly halls of Alexandria to the humble workshops of Nazareth, were entirely unaware that they were poised on the very edge of the incarnation, the pivotal moment of history.
And this fullness wasn't sudden or arbitrary. It was a slow saturation. That's a key idea.
Yes, the fullness of time wasn't a spontaneous snap of God's fingers, but the slow saturation of promise, the culmination of centuries of prophecy, historical developments, cultural trends, unseen spiritual work, drawing all things to their appointed hour.
While rulers governed in blindness.
Driven by their own ambitions, yes. But our research clearly showed that their schemes were small before the immensity of God's design.
So, looking back at all these elements we explored in our research for Chapter 3, the organized infrastructure and underlying emptiness of Rome, the intense religious landscape and deep longing in Judea, the quiet, hidden lives in Galilee, the intellectual and spiritual currents in the wider world like Alexandria and Asia Minor, the watchful Magi, the anticipation in the angelic realm, even the futile opposition of spiritual darkness, they form something cohesive, don't they?
They really do. Our sources lead us to see them as threads in a larger tapestry. God was meticulously weaving together all these seemingly disparate strands: political structures, religious systems, intellectual pursuits, diverse cultures, quiet domestic lives, even human error and spiritual hunger into a single, complex tapestry.
A tapestry that no human hand could have designed or unraveled.
Exactly. It powerfully illustrates how seemingly contradictory or independent elements were all being orchestrated, preparing the specific cultural, social, intellectual, and spiritual environment for the specific time and manner in which Christ would arrive and the gospel would spread.
Even things that seemed counter to God's purposes
Were, in his sovereignty, constrained and used to highlight the very need that only he could meet.
This deep dive, exploring the sources behind Chapter 3 of the Fullness of Time, has really shown us that 12 BC, while outwardly unremarkable, was a year of intense divine purpose.
Definitely. Beneath the surface of empires and daily routines, God was meticulously preparing the world.
We've seen the striking contrasts: Rome's outward peace versus a deep inner restlessness.
The temple's magnificent grandeur versus its poignant spiritual emptiness.
Human ambition playing out versus the quiet, unstoppable progress of divine providence.
Visible earthly power versus the vital hidden preparation happening in obscurity. It's all there.
And the quiet progress of time itself, often unnoticed by those living through it, was accumulating immense sacred significance.
Yes. As our research concludes in the book, 12 BC was not an accident of history, nor was it a mere prelude. It was preparation, sacred preparation.
And with its completion, the world moved 1 year closer.
The world moved 1 year closer to the night when the silence would be broken, the angels would sing, and the light of the world would be born.
The world continued to wait. In its hunger and its systems and its quiet corners, and the fullness of time continued to draw nearer still. Something to ponder about the incredible significance woven into seemingly ordinary moments, and the depth of a plan that unfolds not just in dramatic events, but in the quiet saturation of history, preparing the way for the truth that replaces the lies we believe about ourselves. The core message here on our true identity.